And greetings, dear listeners. This is Ray Powell, and this is Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? Jim Caruso, I am coming to you today from Taipei in Taiwan. In fact, if I look out the window, I can see what used to be the world's tallest building.
It's good to have a good view. I'm still in upstate New York, where it's a beautiful, sunny, cool day.
No tall buildings.
Even more importantly, no buildings, just lots of trees and woodchucks. But I'm really pleased to say today we have a very special guest, entrepreneur, commercial banker, investment banker, jazz musician, producer, educator, Renaissance man of Indonesia, Gita Wirjawan. We first met when Gita was the trade minister under the administration of President Yudhoyono back in the 2011-2014 period. Gita, so good to see you. Welcome.
Likewise,
nice
Jim.
to have you with.
Good to see you too, Ray.
So we'll start with the first question. There were elections held early this year. New president, Probowo Subianto, former general. Americans, we talk about Indonesia as being the largest country Americans know nothing about. But so why should Americans care that there's a new president in Indonesia, and it's President Prabowo?
Well, I mean, for the obvious reasons, including the fact that it's a pretty large democracy. It's the third largest democracy, with the U.S. being the second largest, India being the largest. That puts Indonesia ahead of many other democracies around the world. And it's also the largest country in terms of population, in terms of geographic size in the whole of Southeast Asia. And it's I would argue it's one of the largest in Asia. The fourth reason would be, economically, I think it's poised for, a greater growth trajectory in the next 10 to 20 years, as to be able to position Indonesia in hopefully the top 10 and leading up to a top 5 position if things were to, go okay, as a baseline. Better yet, better than that. The last reason for consideration would be that, Probowo is an internationalist by heart. And this goes back to the way he was brought up. He was brought up in a very international fashion. He was educated, overseas in many parts of the world. He speaks quite a number of foreign languages, including English, German, French, and Dutch, on top of the fact that he speaks Bahasa. So there is a natural inclination for him to try to internationalize the narrative of not only Indonesia, but hopefully Southeast Asia. And this, I think, goes to, the reason why people like me try to go out to try to narrate the Southeast Asian narrative, to try to narrate the Indonesian narrative a little bit better at the rate that, as you aptly pointed out, many people in the U.S., many people around the world really don't understand, about not only Indonesia, but about Southeast Asia, with the absolute exception of Singapore, of course, which has been just doing a really good job in projecting its soft power and telling the world about its, prowess. So I'm in the camp that believes that I think Southeast Asians would have to increase, their storytelling capabilities, and I think Probowo could be well positioned to help do that.
So, Gita, let's start from there. So, as a person who grew up in the Cold War, the term that comes to mind first when I think about Indonesia is non-aligned, right? And so that's maybe again just from a layman's perspective, that's kind of what comes to mind. Obviously, again, very large population. But when Indonesia looks at itself and looks out into the world, what is Indonesia's view of its place first in Southeast Asia, in Asia, and the world?
Well, non-aligned was a term used in 1955, right, on the back of this Asia-Africa conference that took place in a city called Bandung, a town in West Java in Indonesia. and that spirit of, sort of like attaining or maintaining neutrality with respect to, the then superpowers of Soviet Union and the U.S. I think right now could be manifested in, what some large and smaller developing countries are trying to do as to embrace this new narrative called the Global South. Apart from that, I think Indonesia has the very intention of, attaining not just neutrality, but I think optionality. And for a country the size of 280 million people, a GDP of $1.4 trillion, a fairly, present geography, not just in Southeast Asia, but in Asia Pacific, I think it's important for Indonesia to be in a position of leadership, at least with respect to Southeast Asia. Right, and I think Southeast Asia is somewhat manifested in the association called ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. That has been able to, I think, thrive, in my view, by way of its core of centrality, and by way of its ability to continue upon, the pre-existing peace and stability that's been, there for a couple of thousand years. The role of Indonesia going forward is only likely to escalate, for purposes of bringing about centrality for ASEAN or Southeast Asia, but also for making sure that that centrality is of utility when it comes to dealing with, potentially increasing tension between the new superpowers of China and the US, or perhaps, being able to play the role of an interlocutor between the West and China, or an interlocutor between the West and Islam, given the fact that Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country in the world. So I think there's a lot that, Indonesia could tap into. We're not there yet. We're not a great storyteller. We're not ready to position ourselves as a proper interlocutor for those two, previously stated objectives. But I do believe that with the right kind of investment in human capital, taking a long view, I think Indonesia is likely to be, poised for bringing about greater centrality for Southeast Asia, but also a much more internationalist type of role with respect to the rest of the world.
So under President Jokowi, clearly the focus was on domestic issues, and he really did not take a leadership role on even regional issues, I would argue. So you mentioned that you expect President Prabowo to be much more outward looking. How do you think that will manifest?
Well, I think he's going to have to do a bit of calculation, right? You were right. I think there is a contrast between what we might have seen with respect to Jokowi's policy posture internationally versus that of Probowo. I think Probowo has this instinct to be more internationalist. I think he would like to, be able to communicate with the international community in a much more proactive manner. How will that be manifested? I think he will have to do some calculating with respect to a number of possibilities. The first one being whether Indonesia should join, for example, a grouping called the BRICS, right? I think it's no secret that, Indonesia has been somewhat informally asked or invited. But I don't see Probowo being in a position to jump on this very quickly. I think the calculation would have to involve, the extent to which such membership would bring about capital formation, whether or not, or the extent to which such membership would bring about divisiveness, right, with respect to perhaps the West or other parts of the world. So to the extent that his inclination is to try to internationalize the Indonesian narrative. He might have, a different calculation with respect to a grouping called the BRICS. Secondly, what could potentially happen in the South China Sea. I think most countries in Southeast Asia have been hopeful, have been expecting a proactive role from Indonesia as to show leadership and taken on, any potential issue with respect to the South China Sea. That would be the second, I think, obvious possibility. The third possibility would be, how he's going to be able to basically trumpet, the need for Indonesia to basically embrace this energy transition narrative, right? Which I think will require a massive amount of capital formation. Unfortunately or fortunately, the capital or economic capital sits within, or beyond Indonesia. So he needs to actually, much more proactively communicate with economic capital holders and economic capital allocators. Fortunately, many of those are actually within the G7 grouping and also China. So he will need to do a lot more communicating with, G7 countries and also China for purposes of putting forth this energy transition narrative, which could lead up to, the perfecting of the sustainability narrative, right? Which, in my calculation, would require at least $1 trillion for Indonesia to become a modern nation and to become, or to be sourcing its energy, to be metabolizing on a renewable basis. The technological capital could only be availed by countries like the US and Western European countries and other G7 countries, and also China. But it's still not affordable because the affordability for renewabilities is, typical of developing economies at a level of around 5 cents on a per kilowatt basis, whereas most of these renewables technologies could only be availed at a cost of 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So he's got to have to figure out a way to embrace this energy transition narrative in a very carefully crafted manner, so that we can try to attain carbon neutrality as quickly as 2050. But in my view, I think there is no realism with respect to not only Indonesia's, but many other developing economies' abilities to attain carbon neutrality by 2050. The last bit in terms of how, his effort could be manifested would just be simply to play the role of sounding to everybody around the world, including the major powers of the United States, China, Russia, and the rest, so that there could be more peace and stability in other parts of the world. I see those 3 or 4 possibilities as the possible manifestations of what Probowo could be doing.
So Gita, Probowo has gone through a bit of a transformation himself over the last couple of years, from an image of being a person with a past of alleged human rights abuses, to the extent that he was banned to travel to several countries, including the United States, kind of a strong man, to now sort of almost a warm and fuzzy Probowo that sort of emerged during the campaign. Who is Probowo? Who is he really? And how does all of this past experience, or this past with the human rights allegations and all this, how does that inform who he is, how he's going to address the rest of the world, especially that part of the world for which he was persona non grata for a long time?
Well, I believe in evolutionary processes, right? In my view, put aside, whether or not, whatever allegations you aptly pointed out hold water with respect to him. I think there could be debates about some of those allegations, but from what I've seen, I think he's evolved quite a bit. And this is truly manifested in a bit of how you've described him as being warm and fuzzy, right? Ever since he joined the cabinet about 4.5 years ago, nothing that he's done ties to how he would have been described for more than 2 decades, right? And that, I think, speaks of, how he has evolved, how he has aged, and I think more importantly, how he seems more determined to try to leave a good legacy for himself. He's 73 years old now, right? I'm sure when you guys reach that age, you'd be thinking of doing fewer bad things and more good things, right? Well, as opposed to when you would have been 40. I would think of myself as being in that category. I mean, if I were 73, naturally I would be thinking more about positivities as opposed to negativities. And that's just human nature. Whether I'm, showing you a crystal ball here about what's going to unfold, I don't know. But I'm just making an assessment based on what I've seen in him in the last 4.5 years from the periphery, and also how I see him as a human being who's 73 years old, who I think is a lot more determined today to leave, a more positive kind of legacy as opposed to a less positive kind of legacy. And, he's uttered quite a number of statements that, I think resonate to a lot of people in the region, in terms of how he would like to increase or augment the health of the masses in Indonesia. I mean, we can talk about stunting in Indonesia. I mean, it's pretty pervasive, and we've not gotten much better in the last 15 to 20 years.
You'll have to unpack that one for me. Stunting?
Stunting as in malnutrition for kids. And it correlates with, the educational attainment of the young kids. And this is empirically manifested in how Indonesia scored only 69th out of 81 countries measured. And this is in terms of the educational attainment of a 15-year-old in terms of, number 1, lingual proficiency, and number 2, STEM proficiency. Cambodia is number 81. Singapore has moved up from number 2 to number 1 as to topple China, which used to be number 1. Now China is number 2. Vietnam, which, was busy doing, interesting things until the mid-70s, now they're already number 2 in terms of PISA attainment for the 15-year-olds. So stuff like this, I think, resonates to not only Probowo, but many people around him in terms of what they want to do to basically game change the educational attainment. And that, I think, takes a much more structural approach by way of allocating fiscally a lot more, for better nutrition of the kids or the children. He's already uttered, about sending 30,000 Indonesians on an annual basis as to study STEM. This is unprecedented. And when one talks about STEM, we're only talking about the UK, mainland Europe, Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, and the US, and Australia to some extent, right? We only have 8,500 Indonesians studying all across the universities in the US. We only have 4,000 Indonesians studying in the UK as compared to 300,000 to 400,000 Chinese in the US, 200,000 Chinese in the UK. So by saying things like wanting to send 20 to 30,000 Indonesians on a yearly basis to study STEM, by way of saying about wanting to send 10,000 Indonesians to study medicine on a yearly basis, by way of saying with respect to opening up the healthcare sector as to allow foreign doctors to practice in Indonesia, it resonates with people like me. It resonates to a lot of people who want their children to be healthier, more educated, more internationalist. Whether or not he's going to be able to execute or implement any of that, time will tell. But I do believe that, these are things that I would not have expected for him to say, years ago. So that is the kind of evolutionary process that somebody has undertaken, in the last many years.
He, is a former general and a man known for having pretty little patience. I wonder how he's going to react to the ASEAN method of whatever ASEAN does. Consensus, slow moving, bring the last member along. As you said, he's a 73-year-old man who's trying to become president of Indonesia for a long time. My suspicion is he's going to be a man in a hurry. So how do you think he's going to interact with ASEAN? Will he try and lead it, or will he basically forge his own path?
I think he'll try to lead it. He might, his attempt to show leadership to ASEAN will be a welcome undertaking. I would, you can check with our other ASEANites. I think they've been desiring of leadership from Indonesia, which unfortunately hasn't been forthcoming as much as they would have hoped. And this is legacy, right? When we started in 1967, with just 5 founding members of ASEAN, Indonesia through Suharto, was always able to show leadership in a very humble manner, as much as, perhaps the scripting would have been done collectively or perhaps just by 1 or 2 out of the 5. But the humility that was projected by Suharto at that time, I think, was a necessary commodity for bringing about peace and stability for Southeast Asia for a long time. So that could be something that I think Probowo is going to try to emulate. But whatever that's going to come out of him, I think could be very different from whatever we might have seen in the last 9.5 years. And I would opine that it would be something that I think most Southeast Asian countries would be welcoming of.
What are Indonesia's security threats? Is it primarily internal security, or do they look externally and see threats to their territorial integrity or their archipelagic integrity? When they sort of rack and stack what concerns them from a defense and security standpoint, what comes out on top?
I've never been in a camp that's believed of meaningful, if not significant, internal security threats, right? Be it centrifugal or centripetal. I think if there's any potential threat, it could be from beyond, right? But it goes back to what you and I had coffee over, Ray, some time ago. I mean, this relates to what could potentially implode in the South China Sea, with what the Filipinos are doing, with respect to what the Chinese are doing. Look, I used to be a code of conduct optimist, but as I confess to you that my optimism with respect to code of conduct has reduced, right? But going back to the reference to potential leadership being shown by somebody like Probowo, that might be able to put the train back on track as to pursue, what we try to do, in terms of code of conduct, so that we can be a bit more optimistic about the code of conduct. The code of conduct can be resolved, I think, in a multidisciplinary manner, right? One discipline could relate to perhaps the freedom of passage. Another discipline could be with respect to how the economics ought to be spliced between one claimant and another. Another would be just, with respect to simple territorial integrity, which I think is a bit more complicated than the first two, disciplines or dimensions. But stuff like that, I think, is something that Probowo would probably try to consider putting on a table for purposes of discussions with other ASEANites and hopefully with people beyond. And I think his inkling is really to try to multilateralize whatever decision or whatever framework that would be necessary for some sort of a resolution.
So that's a very optimistic point of view, which I happen to agree with, that the world is looking for Indonesian leadership, especially in the South China Sea. Indonesia is respected by all parties. Indonesia may have overlapping claims with China, but has managed it seems, so far pretty well. But I think it means Probowo would have to actively insert himself as a mediator in all this, which would do more to reduce tensions between US and China than almost anything right now outside of Taiwan. So what do you think the US might do to encourage Probowo to take this role and to help him?
Well, I mean, if we can be pragmatic about this, right? I think the US is poised to provide not only economic capital, but also technological capital for the energy transition, not just for Indonesia, but for Southeast Asia, for the rest of the world. I mean, I wrote a paper about this for Southeast Asia. I mean, if Southeast Asia were to try to modernize so that it would reach electrification on a per capita basis at 6,000 kilowatt hour, except for Brunei and Singapore, which are electrified already at about 10,000. And if we were to do that on a renewable basis, we're going to need about $2 to $3 trillion, because we're going to have to build 1 terawatt of power generation capabilities in addition to the pre-existing 400,000 megawatts. So who has that kind of economic capital? Countries like the US and China, right? And if you take a look at the M2, or the liquidity that's floating around in most G7 countries, there's easily $100 trillion worth of liquidity that's floating around that needs to be allocated by the financial capital allocators. And we are seeing signs that, the interest rate environment is likely to change. I think there could be a cut in September, whether it's 25 bips or 50 bips, we don't know. But I think the directionality is that it's only going to come down in the near foreseeable future. And that will, I think, push financial capital allocators to find places to allocate capital. So Southeast Asia, I think, could be a beneficiary, provided that Southeast Asia can account for its rule of law, which unfortunately only Singapore has been able to do well in. The second is the technological capital, right? You've got all the solutions for energy transition, whether it's nuclear, geothermal, hydro, solar, you name it, right? The Chinese, I think, are more competitive, with respect to some of these. But that's where I think Probowo is going to have conversations with the Americans and also the Chinese in terms of how capital formation could be, taken place in Southeast Asia in a better way, technologically and or economically.
if I could quickly follow up, the U.S. and Australia and others have all these programs through the Quad and IPEF and bilateral and multilateral, strictly for the green energy transition. But are you saying that's insufficient, or it's not working, or
It's not working. I mean,
why is that?
We can be realistic, right? I mean, the JETP was announced in November 2022. And we all know that as of today, almost 2 years thereafter, there's not a whole lot of granularity
So
on the implementation.
Just for those of us who, when it comes to economics, are sort of babes in the woods, the JETP.
The JETP was basically a plan that was agreed upon by the United States and Indonesia, announced in November 2022 at the G20 meeting in Bali for $20 billion by way of assistance from the US government. Not sure if it would involve entrepreneurs. The 20 billions would be deployed for purposes of decarbonizing the pre-existing coal-fired power generation capabilities in Indonesia, right? I mentioned the number for Indonesia as to build new power generation capabilities so that we can become modern. We can go up from electrification on a per capita basis of 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000. Indonesia itself will need about $1 trillion. So 20 billion is a drop in the ocean, right? So if the initiative to deploy $20 billion doesn't seem to be moving much almost 2 years after it was announced, I think that needs to be game changed, right? So there needs to be realism with respect to a number of things. Number one, how much is really needed for countries like Indonesia to go green? Number two, what does it take to implement, right? What does it take to deploy the technological capital? What does it take to deploy the economic capital? I mean, there's fiduciary responsibilities, right, for the beneficiary. But I think there needs to be a lot more discussions about what Indonesia needs to be doing so that it can be a beneficiary of that technological capital and economic capital deployment, on a much more real-time basis. And unfortunately, it's just going in circles, in my view.
So let's turn to a little more of a tangible process that's been ongoing now here in Indonesia for a couple of years, and that is the idea of moving the capital of Indonesia from Jakarta to, from what I can tell by looking at my little Encyclopedia Britannica map here, kind of the middle of nowhere. What is actually happening with the moving of the capital, and what do you expect in the future?
Well, I was there about 3 weeks ago for the groundbreaking of a center that's supposed to be doing research on sustainability. And I can tell you it's a massive undertaking. The budget, as what was first announced, was about $33 billion. But I think if it were to come to full fruition, it could go up to between $50 to $100 billion. The deal would have been for the government to basically allocate up to 20% of the total capital requirement, where the remaining 80% of the capital requirement would come from the private sector. The reality is that until today, very little private capital has arrived. So it's been mostly funded from a fiscal standpoint or by government funding. The other reality is that, the tax ratio or the ratio of the tax revenues to the GDP in Indonesia has declined from about 15% to around 10%, between 9.5% to 10%. The other reality is that the portion of the government budget to service the debt has gone up in the last 10 years from about 6% to about 17%. So right there, it tells you that there is a structural fiscal limitation for the government to be allocating a lot more capital for the development of this new capital city in Kalimantan. You're right, it's It's far from lots of places, Ray. And, I drove for 2 hours. I was driven for 2 hours from the city of Balikpapan to the new capital city. They're supposed to be completing the new airport. They have, I think, completed the toll road that takes you from Balikpapan to the new capital city. Net, at the rate that there is structural fiscal limitation, and at the rate that Probowo is going to try to focus on increasing the fiscal space for purposes of not just this, but many other things, I think we have to be a lot more realistic about the pace of development of this new capital city.
And just very quickly, sorry to add on to that, but talk about why there's this imperative to actually do this. What is it that is driving the relocation of this capital city?
Well, the main rationale would have been, as Jokowi had aptly pointed out, to locate it at the center of Indonesia so that there's better redistribution of welfare. That's really his main thesis, right? And whether or not that's going to come to reality, time will tell, right? I mean, we're talking about basically deploying up to or at least 1.5 million civil servants, each one of which would bring his spouse and 2 to 3 children and a couple of mates. So we're talking about the relocation of a few million people from Java or Jakarta to Kalimantan, with the hope that these people would be much more in touch with the starkly different realities in Kalimantan, which are unfortunately not as developed as Java, much less not as developed as Jakarta is. So that proximity to reality would hopefully entail better policy making that would be manifested in better redistribution of welfare. I think that's the main thinking of President Jokowi.
So, we've discussed the desperate need for capital for the energy transition, for building Nusantara, the new capital, for building Indonesia up as a technological powerhouse to convert its natural resources into value-added products. Why, given the GDP growth rate of Indonesia over the years, hasn't this capital really come in the amount that you would expect?
That's a very interesting question. I just did a talk on this. If we take a look at Southeast Asia, for the last 15 years, Southeast Asia has been getting about $200 billion worth of FDI. Half of that, at least, goes to Singapore. So out of $200 billion, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's slightly less, but Singapore has been getting about $100 to $110 billion out of the $200 billion. Whereas Indonesia, in the last 10 years, has been getting about $26 to $31 billion. Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand each would have been getting about $10 to $20 billion. The stark difference between what Indonesia, Thailand, and the rest have been getting with respect to what Singapore has been getting is not about ideology, it's not about geography, it's not about natural resources. It's really about trustworthiness. Right? Singapore has been able to position itself as a trustworthy destination. And that really dovetails into the rule of law. So this is something that I think somebody like Probowo needs to basically embrace. And to the extent he can, I get asked a lot about, why he would have been, telling the electorate and the people around the world that, he's going to be able to grow the economy at 8%. Well, actually, the answer could be in capital formation or foreign direct investment. I mean, the baseline for Indonesia's growth trajectory is around 4.5% to 5%. So if he were to want to grow the economy at 8%, we're only talking about a delta of 3%. So in the context of $1.3 trillion economy, we're talking about $40 billion worth of FDI. So if he's really serious about this, he can forget the other letters of the economic formula, i.e. C, G, X, or M. He can just focus on that letter I, investment. If he were to be able to crank up the FDI from $31 billion to $71 billion with a delta of $40 billion, game on, right? He's going to be able to deliver 8% growth. This is before the multiplier effect. Now, 71 billion is still a lot less than what Singapore has been able to get every year. And this is on the back of massive liquidity within the G7.
So if you had to do three things to bring in that capital, what would they be? You're a financier. What three things should he do to attract capital?
Well, rule of law is not about absolutism. It's really about directionality, right? So if he were to do one or two things as to improve the enforceability of rules and regulations, as soon as potential investors perceive that he is actually walking the talk with respect to increasing the enforceability of rules and regulations, money will come in. It doesn't have to be today, right? The perfection of the enforceability of rules and regulations does not necessarily have to be today, but if he's taken 1, 2, or 3 steps as to move the needle, as to approach a higher degree of enforceability of rules and regulations, I think money will come disproportionately much more than whatever we might have been seeing so far, because that liquidity just needs to be allocated. And the second, I think he needs to be quite pronounced about how that capital is going to be utilized, right? Now, you take a look at Southeast Asia, right? I think it's fair to assume that Malaysia has been really good at positioning itself as a semiconductor, right, destination. I mean, you're seeing the Intels of the world, the Nvidias of the world, pumping, capital into that destination. You see Thailand as a very, very robust player in the automotive, right? And they've been able to get BYD to open up a factory that employs 5,000 people. Indonesia, I think, has quite robustly played the role of the automotive, right, destination for the Japanese. Now, or lately, increasingly, the Koreans. We're seeing the presence of the Hyundais and the Kias and the Hyundais of the world. They're thinking of building factories in Indonesia, along with their peripheral supporting industries, the components and the batteries and all that stuff, right? So I think Probowo and his team would have to figure out what makes sense for Indonesia so that it differentiates itself from the Singapores of the world, which is at the top echelon of the value chain. Malaysia getting towards the top echelon of the value chain. Thailand and Indonesia being at the same place. Vietnam, I think, they've been in the steel making capabilities, the car making capabilities. The Philippines, a lot more in the services. I think Indonesia would have to position itself very robustly in terms of how it's going to be able to move up the value chain without infringing upon the pre-existing narratives of the neighbors. I think that could be played out quite nicely.
Well, on that note, Gita Wirjawan, you also have a podcast. It is called Endgame. So why is it called Endgame, and why should people listen?
It's funny. It's got nothing to do with the movies, right? And all my life, whenever I interviewed people, I always ask him or her, what's your end game? Where do you see yourself ending up as? And I've started asking that question to myself. What's my end game? Where do I want to be? That's why I came up with the title, Endgame.
And why should people listen?
Well, it's educational. It's long form, unlike what you might see on TikTok or Instagram, which is only 30 seconds or 3 minutes. I'm in a camp that believes that there's a lot of good contents on social media, but there's a lot more not so good contents. And I'm on a mission to basically just pipe as much wisdom into the minds of the people. So I'm in a camp that believes that the democratization of information really hasn't led up to a commensurate democratization of ideas. And Endgame was designed for better democratization of ideas. And so far, I think so good. We started this thought experiment a little over 3.5 years ago, thinking that, we'd be happy to get 5,000 views. We've gotten cumulatively about 85 million views with 192 episodes. And we're viewed in more than 50 countries. So the last bit is really, if you take a look at Indonesia, there's probably no more than 10 million people that speak good English out of 280 million people. If you take a look at Southeast Asia, there's no more than 60 million people that speak good English, most of which are the Filipinos, Malaysians, and Singaporeans. The rest, they don't speak, right? So I've been thinking about, how about if we move the needle for Indonesia from 10 million to 100 million? How about if we move the needle for Southeast Asia from 60 million to 300 million people that could speak English? And I'm not the marketing director for English here. I'm just being a realist, because most of wisdom is documented in English. Large language model is documented in English, and most economic activities are undertaken in English. You put an Ethiopian and a Filipino in a room trying to trade with each other, they're not going to speak Mandarin, they're not going to speak Japanese, Italian, or Spanish. They're going to have to speak English. So that's the reality. So for purposes of not only Indonesia, but Southeast Asia's embracing wisdom a bit more and expanding its pre-existing economic pie. So I want more and more people to speak English, which is why I've been doing a lot more content on my podcast in English, by way of interviewing people all over the world, really.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, because frankly, I'm just too damn old to learn any more languages. So thank you, sir, for joining us. I do appreciate it's been a really fascinating tour around a country I know too little about. Jim knows a lot more than I do. It's been a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Jim, for having me.
Okay, well, Gita, as always, a very thoughtful interlocutor, very knowledgeable. He does not, frankly, represent the typical Indonesian or typical human. He does so many things very well, clearly intellectual, very skilled. But his insights, I think, are important. One thing, when I was in Indonesia with the U.S. Embassy in 2011 to 14 or so, I was dealing with Gita as economic counselor at the embassy, and we talked about the exact same things about energy transition, providing enough energy to the Indonesian people, the lack of education, especially in STEM, the lack of ability to attract foreign direct investment. So it's a little disturbing that a decade later, these are still the problems that have to be solved. And it's not clear to me from our conversation how Probowo was going to do that, but maybe he has energy and will too.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Jim, because for a lot of developing countries, the question of going carbon neutral is kind of an esoteric, what we used to call first world problem, right? It's nice for you Americans and Europeans to talk about this as a goal, and of sorts in general terms. Of course, we want to stem climate change, and we want to do all of these carbon neutral things. But we've got to industrialize because we have to, feed and clothe and get healthcare to our people. So, for Indonesia, what is the imperative? Is it imperative to meet certain carbon goals, or is it imperative to actually meet certain energy goals that are not being met with current sources of energy?
Well, the first thing is to develop enough electricity to satisfy the needs of the Indonesian people and industry. So as a result, Indonesia is a huge producer of coal. They mine a lot of coal, and they burn a lot of coal because it's cheap. They dig it out of the ground, put it in the furnace, and off comes the electrons. However, Indonesia is made up of 16,000 islands, and it's very inefficient to ship coal from Java and Kalimantan to some of these outlying islands. Right now, they tend to burn diesel, which is incredibly dirty and inefficient. So we were pushing for years to convert at least the outlying islands to renewables, because it'd be cheaper than transporting the coal or diesel.
Yeah.
But it's hard to break the monopolies, the way of doing business, and to get the capital for the conversion.
Right.
So it's an interesting problem.
Yeah.
But anyway, Indonesia to me is endlessly fascinating, huge potential, huge issues.
Yeah.
Speaking of issues, Ray, you and I read the comments from our podcast. We read them assiduously, even if we don't respond. Most of the comments I think are pretty positive, but there is a cohort of folks who look at what we say and keep saying we are just paid propagandists of the US government, even though I would argue we don't tend to take positions that much as opposed to listen to our guests. But anyway, Colonel Powell, how do you respond to the argument that you are a paid US government propagandist?
Well, Jim, as you know, I have other pursuits. One of them, of course, was with Sea Light, which is the group that I lead from Stanford that focuses a lot on Chinese maritime aggressions, especially in the South China Sea. So I get that probably even more because of my Sea Light hat than because of our podcast here. So maybe some of that may be sort of sloshing over onto you, I'm afraid. But, I mean, yes, I get a lot of it. In fact, I was just down in my wife's hometown of Davao City. I was foolish enough to post about this on X, my Twitter page or my X page. And immediately or very soon afterward, there was a picture of sort of some unknown Caucasian person in a National Bureau of Investigation hat talking to a Philippine policeman in Davao City. And the rumor began to spread around these, sort of circles in social media that I was that person. And what was I doing mucking around in Davao City with the police? And I must be up to some sort of plot. Of course, the idea that I'm an intelligence officer, that I've got a lot of money coming from the CIA or from other government sources. So I get this quite a bit. And it's very hard to sort of push back because you can't prove a negative, right? You can't say, no, I'm not, right? I mean, it's not like I can just sort of roll out all my bank accounts and see there's no big, checks except for my pension coming into these bank accounts. So, mostly, honestly, I often just sort of have fun with it. It's some of the things that come up are kind of amusing. I was once accused of having a $500 million propaganda budget from the U.S. Government. My wife asks me about this all the time when I'm going to sort of start forking over some of this $500 million. And of course, it was actually funny because just a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, showed up in Manila with a $500 million foreign military financing package for the Philippines. And so my wife's like, oh, great. We should go over to Manila to make sure you can get your money. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's been my approach. I get questions from other people who kind of face some of the same things. What do you do about it? And again, I think you and I, Jim, have been around even in the United States. Depends on which news programs you watch as to which conspiracy theories you sort of roll across. And so we know that this is not something that's unique to this area, to this region. It's innate to human nature and the current state of our media. There are just going to be conspiracy theories, and they're really easy to get out there now. And if you worry about them, I think you just you just can't worry about them. It's just too much.
Yeah, it's the old Oscar Wilde thing. It's better to be talked about than not talked about.
Yeah.
So we'll take that as a positive. But what I hope everyone does is just listen to what's being presented and consider the argument as opposed to who's presenting it. You know, the fact is we're just a couple guys with our producer Ian doing this because we think it's important. No compensation. It's just important to us. But beyond that, it's just important to have these discussions because they affect our lives and will affect the lives of our children and grandchildren. So I really would love more comments about the content and the arguments and less about.
And to be fair, we do get those. You know, there are lots of
yes,
great comments.
absolutely.
And in fact,
Absolutely.
we would even encourage people if they have specific questions. You know, we'd love to be able to respond to questions at the end of some of these too.
No, it's as you said, it's the new way of the world is people can vent and throw mud, but that's why we have windshield wipers.
That's right. Well, again, it's always been fun getting with you, Jim. And for our listeners, again, most of the comments that we get are actually really positive, and even a lot of the ones that aren't positive are constructive and interesting and make us think. So thank you for all of those. If you do watch us on YouTube and you like podcasts, audio podcasts like I do, you know, you can always download us on a streaming service because we're also there. And if you're only listening to us and you want to see what we look like, you can flip over to our YouTube channel, which is YouTube at IP Podcast, and you can watch us there. And so whatever works best for you, there are ways to communicate with us. But probably the easiest one, the one that we see most, where there are the most comments, are on the YouTube channel. So with that, I want to thank Jim for getting with me. I will be back in California next week for once in this summer. This will be actually first time since June that I've been in California. And for Ian Ellis Jones, our outstanding producer. And by the way, if you're not following him on X, you should absolutely be doing that because he has his graphics that are depicting a lot of what's been going on, especially in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, are really outstanding and getting a lot of attention. So certainly be following him. And for all of us, we want to wish you a great day. And thanks for watching Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? Farewell.